Joining me now is Nariman Behravesh. He is the chief economist at IHS Global Insight. Thank you, Nariman Behravesh, for joining us. Let's just talk a little bit about what Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy were saying. They're saying they're convinced that Greece can stay in the euro. Could they stay in the euro if they defaulted?
Absolutely. And I think Greece is better off defaulting within the eurozone than outside, because if they defaulted outside the eurozone, they'd be completely frozen out of credit markets. It would be a disaster.
I put it to you, Argentina managed to make a very strong comeback. In fact, the man in charge of that, did the biggest sovereign debt crisis in 2001, says that Greece should default, and default big time.
Well, I mean, fair enough, except that I think there's a lot of advantages, especially in the long term, of Greece being sort of part of that whole unit. Argentina didn't have that choice. I mean, it really didn't. Whereas Greece does. And I think there are advantages for Greece, including access to all these various funds that have been set aside. So I think in the end, Greece will default, but probably within the eurozone. It also benefits the eurozone because once Greece goes, assuming they can negotiate it, then the question is who else? Where does this stop?
Precisely, the domino effect. But it's also just, it's almost been hinted, I think. Angela Merkel saying the other day that she didn't want Greece to have an orderly or disorderly default. Does that mean she's putting up everybody getting ready for an orderly default?
Well, of course, it all depends on what we mean by that. And the good news, bad news is that this has been dragging on so long that it's not fully anticipated, but largely anticipated. And from that perspective, I think a lot of investors and financial institutions have had a chance to reduce their exposure to Greece. So in that sense, it's actually fairly good news.
Right, but let's talk a little bit here also about China's role in all this. So the other day, conveniently just before an Italian bond auction, there was a story which came out that the Chinese were going to buy Italian bonds. Now, we've had a senior official right here in Dalian saying that they are willing to buy sovereign debt crisis hit fixed income instruments, right? Well, what's in it for them and what's in it for the country selling them, basically?
Well, certainly in terms of Italy, just to have the confidence of a Chinese government or a Chinese institution buying their debt is a big plus. Now, I don't think there's a lot in it for China to buy Italian bonds at this point. I mean, why would they do that? I think to buy stock, let's say an Italian company, that's a different story.
They could buy some of the assets which might go off and there could be a fire sale.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's much more sensible than buying Italian bonds. I mean, my advice would be stay away from Italian bonds, but buy other Italian assets.
All right, well, we've also, of course, today marks, well, in some senses anyway, the two-day period, the third anniversary of the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Now, that was something which came as an absolute shock. Greek default is something everybody's been talking about. Does that mean that we have a lesser blow?
I think the answer is yes. I'm not terribly worried about a Lehman kind of event, a Lehman moment, if you will, in the case of the Eurozone, precisely for the reason you're saying is long anticipated. But the other thing is that having learned the lesson from Lehman, the European authorities will not let a big European bank go under. They just won't. Okay, I want to talk about the global economy in a sense. And how close are we to recession now? Because we've seen anemic growth in the US. Europe is being slated to have perhaps even a greater slowdown looking into 2012. Now, you say, actually, that slow growth is one thing, fragile growth is something else. And I think I'm going to quote you here. You're talking here also about, you say that the biggest policy mistake, you say a policy mistake is the single biggest risk to these economies. I think that's absolutely right. The issue here with Europe and the US is growth is so slow that they're very vulnerable to a shock. So then you ask sort of what kind of shock could do the trick in terms of pushing us over the edge. And here, I think it is a policy shock, whether it's a reprise of that stupid argument the Congress had, or the Europeans being paralyzed.
But have they already made that mistake with the hiking of rates?
The ECB, you mean the European Central Bank? Arguably, yes. I mean, it's sort of looking back, it's sort of unfathomable as to why they would raise interest rates. They may well reverse course in the next few months. But I think, yes, inadvertent or advertent tightening is probably the worst thing they could do right now.
And very quickly, in 10 seconds, and Asia continues to be the star performer.
Absolutely. The growth will be hurt a little bit, but the good news is domestic demand, interregional trade will provide that buffer.
Nariman Behravesh, thank you very much indeed.